Why shouldn't noir be morally gray? Of course, you can have a noir book that is framed in terms of moral grayness, but the reality is moral grayness is actually antithetical to the project of the noir genre. And here's why. Starting with perhaps the too obvious, noir means black. So metaphorically, it's referring to the dark, malicious, bad acts, or even the darkness of the night, where most noir stories are very prominently feature the night in many cases, and more things take place at night than in other stories. But the blackness, the darkness of noir is essential. It needs to be black, not gray, because the power of noir comes from the contrast between the black and the white. If you do not have a sense of black and white, or to speak in terms of morality, of a sense of right and wrong, then noir actually loses its power because it has no contrast with which to work. The noir project, I think, is at its most effective precisely when it's leaning on that contrast and building on that. When you get narratives that are about having empathy towards people who are doing terrible things without losing the sense that the things they're doing is terrible. It's like saying this murderer needs a good criminal defense, even if the murderer was heinous. Or this thief, it was wrong for him to steal, and it's also wrong how he's been treated growing up and how he arrived at this place. In a word, noir needs that complexity. And when you get noir style stories, leaning into moral grayness instead of black and white, you actually you lose a lot of the narrative power and effect that noir can have, and the ability to have nuanced discussions about ethics and build empathy towards people across very different classes, moral structures. Because you need to be able to acknowledge harm in multiple places, not just the harm that you identify with most, in terms of building actual empathy and building a good understanding of morality. So it's not enough to say, this kid was raised in the slums and has a terrible life, and that's why he steals, and he's justified in doing so. It's actually like the issue is that final step in saying it's justified. If you can say pretty much all of that, but once you get to the point where you start justifying the wrong actions instead of having empathy for them, you start getting into a morally gray territory, and you start losing the moral complexity where you're willing to acknowledge many kinds of harm. That just because somebody is a victim doesn't mean that they can't also be a victimizer. And that's really what this noir is full of, is people who are caught in cycles of violence, or people who go from victim to victimizer, or from victimizer to victim. And these very complex stories about understanding people and why we need to listen to people's stories, even if they're doing bad things. And I think that's really the strongest thesis that noir can produce, is saying we need to listen to people even if they do terrible things. Because even people who do terrible things can be suffering from something legitimately and trying to raise awareness, or, I mean, usually they're not directly trying to raise awareness, but like, they can be responding to very real issues, basically. And we need to look beyond sometimes just their actions and be willing to look at their circumstances and conditions and develop a holistic view of society and understand these more complex evils like poverty and systemic abuse, and systemic failure, systemic racism, things like that. Noir is excellent at pointing those things out. But noir can't do that if it loses its sense of morality. An amoral noir isn't capable of having these discussions, or of fostering empathy, or encouraging people to have empathy even for the terrible. Just to make a quick comparison, it's almost, noir is basically what you'd get if, in Les Miserables, if Jean Valjean didn't repent, if he didn't change his mind. All the points in Les Miserables about how the French justice system is excessive, it's cruel, it's harsh, those would still be true even if Jean Valjean never repented. And that's kind of where noir sits. It's trying to force you to look at that in that angle. Les Miserables is probably more palatable in terms of getting people to see that injustice and cruelty. But noir's approach has its own merits in terms of inviting us to look at these things and to not fall for the trap that you could fall in with Jean Valjean, that the cruelties of a justice system are only cruel if the prisoner is going to repent later. If a prison system is cruel, it's cruel. COC, it is. Justice isn't about what the right thing to do with a convict. That doesn't come down. That's not a question of whether they're going to repent if you treat them nicely, or if they're not going to reoffend later. That's not really a very rich definition of justice, because there are a lot of people who do deserve a second chance who don't use that second chance well. Even third chances sometimes. Sometimes they fail even the third chance. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't. Like that's, I think, the line to draw between what noir adds that Les Mis doesn't necessarily, is that even when someone gets a second chance and squanders it, that doesn't mean they didn't deserve the second chance. So that's the kind of conversation I think noir can add to the conversation of ethics, and that a more accessible story like Les Miserables can't, or doesn't necessarily. Though if you do a complex reading of Les Miserables is a pretty complex text, so a very rich text. So you could probably get at that eventually. But noir is very blunt about that, about calling out, like noir that calls out injustice. Like that is the best of the genre. When it calls it out clearly and concisely, and when it doesn't feel the need to ignore other evils in order to do so. When it's willing to say robbery is bad, murder is bad, gang violence is bad, mafioso style action is bad, corrupt police, corrupt politicians, like being willing to say, it's like being willing to acknowledge the blackness in it all, that it is all noir. That is not just the poor, the violent, those with dirty hands that have guilt. But it's people with clean hands, people who run businesses, people who sometimes even people who have no clue how their actions hurt people. I think that's really where noir is important. And you can't do that if you get into moral grayness. You need to retain a sense of black and white. And when I say black and white, not in a sense of moral reductivism, but you need a sense of right and wrong, that some things are good and some things are bad. Because otherwise you don't have noir. You have gris. You have something that isn't noir. And just to extend the point, you can see this also with other genres such as like cyberpunk, or like several of the punk genres or other critical genres, where they get into moral grayness and they kind of lose the ability to critique. Because if you're not willing to critique if you're not willing to acknowledge the faults in your own camp or in people you associate with, it becomes really hard to talk to other people who are not in your camp. Because it's like you don't get to, it's not moral to say, I am moral, you're not moral, and that's that. Which is oftentimes what moral grayness actually is a refusal to acknowledge the moral legitimacy in other parties or moral flaws in one's own party. And that's where the gray comes in. It's that mixture. It's the fact that the grayness comes in from calling your blacks whites and other people's whites blacks or grays. Because you usually you often don't even get to that full inversion. You often just get to grays because it's a lot harder to do that full inversion. Anyway, so this is just an appeal for a certain sense of noir that I think is richer and has a better sense of the world, is more accurate, is more rich, creates a better discussion between author and reader, and between several readers of a text, and it gives you more as a reader to draw from the text. If you're not just getting cut, because you can actually discuss the ethics in a way that if you start getting into moral relativism and moral grayness and things like that, you're just not going to be able to do. So take care, see y'all on the flip side, and enjoy literature. Au revoir.